Greetings, this is Griff Ruby with part 55 of my series Ecclesiology for Sedevacantists, based on Dogmatic Theology, Volume 2, Christ Church by Msgr G. van Noort. Continuing on, page 164, we get to the next mark, catholicity. Catholicity, by right, is not a mark of the Church, but rather a necessary preliminary to the mark itself. The mark of Catholicity, then, means exclusively that Catholicity in fact, which should always be found in the true Church, is morally universal diffusion. That this sort of Catholicity, when viewed concretely, that is, as comprising genuine unity and the unbroken preservation of that unity throughout many centuries without recourse to force or military might, amounts to a moral miracle no one of good sense will doubt. Such God-given unity, therefore, cannot be a property of a false religion. That other requirements of a mark are verifiable in the criteria of Catholicity in fact should be obvious. So, observe, some theologians incorrectly, at least in our opinion, claim that the true Church of Christ, because of this mark of Catholicity, should always possess a larger number of members than any sect. But Catholicity does not consist merely in numbers. It also requires diffusion throughout the world. That is why no sect, however numerous its adherents, can ever be morally universal. In other words, there could never exist, in addition to the true Church of Christ, some other religious society which, while retaining genuine unity, would be spread among a great number of diverse peoples for a long time. Now, a few segments ago, back at about 46, I believe it was, I actually did list where, in a particular instance, a traditional priest in Germany was receiving some persecution. And all this groundswell of support came flowing in from a whole host of countries. And as I said, some of which I know nothing of the details of what traditional Catholicism even lives in those countries. But obviously something does, because there were people coming out in love and support for this persecuted priest. And that, to me, is just one very dramatic example. You can always find somewhere. It may be very hard, it may be very few. You may even have to go outside the borders of your own country. But somewhere there is always some traditional cleric or somebody to turn to that, and it is always the same belief. We are all around the world, as the church has always been all around the world from the earliest times onward. We've retained that. In a way, that's kind of part of the difficulty, because there's so few of us now. We're spread so thin. We're kind of like individual logs trying to keep burning without a few other logs close by to really make a fire. So it's amazing that any of our remote logs are still, by themselves yet staying aflame. That's like a miracle when you think about it. So, but there's no denying that if there could be more of us in at least some place or other, there could be definitely something very strong. And there are a few hubs of traditional Catholic activity, and indeed that is exactly what one finds in these hubs, is places where sainthood, not just merely good people like you could find anywhere else, but dramatic holiness is something that's found on a routine basis. Okay, but there's also the fact that it has to be not only around the world, but in all times. Now, the Novus Ordo, well, I've already indicated, it has a lot of different religions. The Santeria Novus Ordo, the Saint Death Mexican Novus Ordo, the chicken sacrificing African Novus Ordo, and so forth. They've got a high church Novus Ordo, a low church Novus Ordo, a charismatic Novus Ordo. There's no unity there. There's nothing. Whereas our one faith is everywhere, and more than that, all times. You go back before Vatican II, Novus Ordo does not exist. And I think if you go far enough into the future, I believe there'll come a time when the Novus Ordo will have gone the way of any of a variety of ancient sects that have disappeared. Either that or Novus Ordo turns into the great harlot of biblical prophecy, one or the other. All right, fourth mark. Apostolicity. Apostolicity of doctrine should not be listed as a mark of the church because it is not something obvious. I mean, it's like, how can you know what's the right doctrine when all you have to compare against it is the doctrine itself? Furthermore, it is not something easier to recognize than the true church herself, for it is extraordinarily difficult, in fact impossible, to have certitude about the entire body of doctrine taught by the apostles without the testimony of Christ's church. It presumes, then, that the church is already identified. That is why the rule of faith has always been, find out who are the successors of the apostles and which society is a continuation of the church planted by the apostles. Then you will be able to receive the pure and complete doctrine taught by the apostles. Notice, too, that apostolicity of doctrine, taken all by itself, would be only a negative mark of the church, for there is nothing intrinsically contradictory in the notion of having some sect retain the doctrine of the apostles in its entirety. This point alone is guaranteed by that negative criterion. If it is proven that a Christian denomination has departed from even one point of doctrine taught by the apostles, by that very fact it is convicted of being counterfeit. So that's all it takes to be able to show the Novus Ordo isn't Catholic, because it has departed from a number of points of doctrine as held by the apostles. However, we have not. But the mark of apostolicity, then, is found in the apostolicity of both membership and government. We alone have that. Our traditional bishops are the only legitimate bishops, as I described in another previous section back in number 47, I believe. 48. Part 48, I talked about that very specifically. Our traditional bishops are the only successors that the ancient apostles have. There's no one else out there qualified. So these two factors are, of course, only inadequately distinguished from one another. Even though this double sort of apostolicity is not obvious to all men, but only to those who are fairly well versed in history, it clearly fulfills all the requirements for a genuine mark. Observe. If one considers apostolicity in purely abstract fashion, it is simply an historical fact if one views it concretely, that is, as including the unconquerable stability of that same church which has existed as a worldwide organization throughout 1900 years, now coming up on almost 2,000 years as I say this now. It is at the same time a moral miracle that we have demonstrated in the treatise The True Religion. So, I mean, true, there's a huge conquest at Vatican II, but we're still here. We can't be conquered. We cannot be conquered. If we can be conquered, it's time to go find another savior, because that's all there is to it. Well, I think that's enough for this. Thank you very much.